Добрий вечір, шановні друзі і колеги. Я, мабуть, відразу перейду на англійську. So switching into English, which is a working language as usual for this evening. First of all, I would like to express my unbelievable thankfulness to Professor Timoty Снайдер for his solidarity and for his constant readiness to come to Kyiv and participate at our events. And last year we hosted Professor Snyder at the opening of Visual Culture Research Center venue not far from here, and this time I'm really happy to have him at the Kyiv Biennial. And today we are continuing the debate session, which is framed as and called as the School of Abducted Europe, which we started yesterday with a discussion called What Europe Does Ukraine Need? And today Professor Snyder will deliver a lecture called Ukraine is Europe's Dilemma. And of course I know that the Ukrainian audience is pretty acquainted with Professor Snyder, but just to mention a couple of things about our speaker. That Timoty Snyder is a professor of history at Yale University and an author of numerous works on Central and Eastern European history. And his books, Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin, The Red Prince, and Ukrainian history, Russian politics and European future were published in Ukrainian. And I have to say that his last astonishing book, Black Earth, the Holocaust as History and Warning, has been just published a couple of days ago, so congratulations. I just also wanted to add that this program of the School of Abducted Europe was developed and elaborated by two institutions. The first one is the Institute for Human Sciences, IWM in Vienna, and another one is a Kyiv one, which I represent, called Visual Culture Research Center. And really, it's very important to have Timoty Snyder's contribution and at this series of panels, because I would say that he is a main sort of translator or the medium of Ukraine on the international arena, meaning that his works and articles, especially in the context of the Maidan uprising and Russia's war afterwards and occupation of the Ukrainian territories, played a crucial role for the Western public to understand the Ukrainian events. And he was also the main organizer of the conference Ukraine Thinking Together last year, and our School of Abducted Europe is also conceptually connected with that conference. So thank you again. Thank you, Timoty Snyder, Europe as Ukraine as Europe's dilemma, and probably vice versa. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Vasil. Before I speak to you for perhaps half an hour about Ukraine as Europe's dilemma, or Europe as Ukraine's dilemma, I want to say a word about a new program at the Institute of Human Sciences, the Institute Nauki, Nauki in Vienna. We have just started a program called Ukraine in European Dialogue, which will involve inviting 2 younger researchers every year to come to Vienna for a research stay of 6 months. It will also involve a senior fellowship for philosophers, theologians, people who are prominent in public ethics, which will be named after Andrei Zaptinsky. And then it will involve as well, the third element will be shorter visits for people from Ukraine who come and give a presentation and stay for a few days or a week or a couple of months. Again, the program will be called Ukraine and European Dialogue. Чи всі розуміли, чи маю повторити українською? Розуміли всі? Справді всі? Так? Добре. Okay. So я буду говорити мовою рідною, а не державною. So what I'd like to do is share with you a few thoughts about the relationship between Ukraine and Europe and Ukraine in the last couple of years. I will give away the conclusion at the beginning, in case any of you have a train that you need to catch. The conclusion is that Ukraine and Europe are, as Vasil unintentionally said, are each other's dilemma, that they are each for the other an inescapable problem. For good or for ill, Ukraine and Europe are in this together. I'd like to make this case in 6 parts. I'm going to talk about 6 different dilemmas or 6 mutual relationships that I think are both very close and in a sense inevitable. And because I can't really count past 3 or 4, I'm going to look at my notes for this. So the 6 dilemmas have to do with history, with the nation, with civil society, with truth, with war, and with the attraction of the European Union. So my first dilemma has to do with history. And it's a dilemma from the point of view of both Ukrainians and Europeans. And the dilemma is this. Ukrainian history makes no sense without mainstreaming it, without putting it into the mainstream of European history. Meanwhile, European history doesn't make any sense without the inclusion of Ukraine. I'll make this case very quickly using a few examples. When I teach Ukrainian history this way to my students at Yale who come from Ukraine, they get sort of shocked and put down their pencils and stop writing. I won't even say what the Russians do. But when you look at the history of Ukraine, what you see is every major theme of European history, but in a kind of exaggerated form. So the Christian conversions, yes, but involving Vikings and Khazars and Jews and all kinds of other mixtures. The Renaissance, absolutely, you have the Renaissance, but the Renaissance in a form which comes by way of Polish and Latin on a territory where Roman power never extended. So the interesting thing about the Renaissance in this part of the world is that you can have a Renaissance without a naissance. That is, you can be reborn without ever being born in the first place, right? Which is good news for like robots who want to be born again Christians, I guess, but it's a little, okay. That was my avant-garde joke for the night, so like so you had to laugh there, because like I'm going to be real traditional from now on. Okay, so you're not robots who want to be born again Christians, you've established that, because robots who want to be born again Christians find that joke hilarious, all right. And you have a Reformation, but it's not just a Reformation where you have Catholics and Protestants. It's a Reformation with the Orthodox, with Greek Catholics, with multiple kinds of Protestants, and with Roman Catholics, of course. You have everything. You have the Baroque. You even have the Enlightenment in a kind of very interesting Polonized form, discussions about how you create a republic. So, you have basically every interesting theme that exists in European history, you can pull out the Ukrainian version. So the big conflict in history between, for example, the settled civilizations and nomadic warriors, right? You have that with the confrontation with the Mongols in 1241 in an extraordinarily dramatic form. The question of the establishment of a mobile European civilization. That is, a form of civilization that exists as writing, which you can take from place to place. You have that as well in the history of Rus, or the history of Ukraine, in the history of Old Church Slavonic, and how that becomes Chancery Slavonic, which is the language of Rus, which in turn becomes the language of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, right? So this idea of creating a legal culture, which is mobile, which is essential to all of Western civilization, that's also here in your history. So I'm telling you things that you know, although maybe in slightly different words. But the point is that if you just take the most conservative categories of European history and apply them to Ukraine, you then see that Ukrainian history makes sense within those categories. Now, where things truly start to get interesting, as I see things, is in the 19th and 20th centuries. And here is the place where European history actually needs Ukrainian history. and let me try to tell you why. The main theme in the history of Europe and the world in the 19th and 20th century is the theme of colonization and decolonization. That is the main theme. And it's generally taken to involve Europeans who, if you don't like colonization, are the bad guys, but if you like colonization, they're the good guys, right? If you're in favor of empire, yay Europe. If you're against empire, boo Europe. It's basically taken to be a history of Europe and the rest of the world, right? But in fact, the history of colonization and decolonization has nothing to do with Europe and the rest of the world. In fact, the history of colonization and decolonization is a history which takes place in Europe as well, right? From the Balkan rebellions of the early 19th century through the national movements in Ukraine, in Poland, in Lithuania, and elsewhere, the idea of decolonization is the same thing that you call national revival. It's the same history, it's the same language. It's just that since it happens in Europe, it's not recognized as such. And unfortunately, with this theme as well, with this theme of decolonization and colonization, the Ukrainian version is much more intense than everywhere else. What do I mean by that? I mean that the idea that Ukraine should be someone's colony is an idea which is continued throughout the 20th century. In the Soviet idea that Ukraine should be the breadbasket for the rest of the USSR, this is what Stalin himself calls internal colonization. Stalin makes the argument explicitly. He says, because we don't have maritime colonies, we don't have far-ranging colonies like the British, we have to colonize ourselves. And that means above all Ukraine, which means collectivization and all that follows from collectivization, right? Meanwhile, Hitler's idea for colonization in the 20th century is also Ukraine. Lebensraum, living space, also means above all things Ukraine. So in these modern neo-colonial ideas, Ukraine is at the center, not just of one, but of two, which helps to explain why the history of Ukraine is so absolutely tragic between 1933 and 1945. Now, what I'm trying to say is that the history of Europe only makes sense if some argument, like the argument I've just made, is included. I'm not saying that every German has to agree with every word I've just said, or that every European has to agree with every formulation. But the point is that unless you have Ukraine on your mental map, you can't really make sense of what the Soviet Union was doing, and you can't make sense of what Nazi Germany was doing. And if you can't make sense of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, then you can't make sense of the European 20th century. So in this way, Ukraine is like the crucial piece of the puzzle that sits right in the middle. It's not just a piece of the puzzle, it's a central part of the story. And that story is largely absent, or that part of the story is largely absent. And really only in the last 2 years have Europeans at all started to think about where Europe fits into their stories. Anyway, so that's my first dilemma. Europeans have, as I see it, have their own history wrong because they miss the Ukrainian piece, which means they miss how colonization and decolonization actually work. Meanwhile, Ukrainians trying to make sense of their own history, I don't think can really do it, this is the other side of the point, cannot really do it along national lines. Okay, so like just to give away my premises at the beginning, national history is one of these things like ice cream that's fun, it's nice, but like it's not a full meal. Okay, it may be for dessert, like at the end, like after you're done with everything else, national history is okay. But like it has its place. Okay, I'm not saying national history is illegitimate any more than I would say ice cream is illegitimate. I mean, as a father of 2 small children, I would never say that ice cream is illegitimate. It has its place. It's not that I'm saying it's wrong. It works as well as any other method. But the mistake is to say that national history is the same thing as history. The irony is always that if you want to understand the history of your own nation, the only way to do it is to have some larger framework, right? Whether that's a European framework or a global framework. So even if all you care about is Ukrainian history, you have to have some bigger framework, like I'm suggesting here, the European framework. Okay, so that's the ice cream joke always drives people away. That's the first dilemma. Second dilemma is related, and that has to do with the nation. Okay, so what is the nation really? What is the nation state really? And here I have to check my notes to answer that question. Okay, so in the way that I've talked to you about history, what happens with the nation state is that it turns out to be, let's say, necessary, but not sufficient. Okay, so you might think when you look at Ukrainian history, if you look at the West Ukrainian National Republic or the Ukrainian National Republic, the states that were founded after the First World War, that then collapsed, that's exceptional. No, that's totally normal. Nation states always collapse. Nation states are bound to collapse. With maybe the exception of the United States, I don't know, I mean, we're working on it. But in general, nation states are bound to collapse. Even the Germans could not make a nation state. And my basic view is like, my basic view on life, I mean reported, is that if the Germans can't do it, it can't be done. Even the Germans can't make a nation state. They tried in 1871. A generation later, they started or took a major part in a major world war. Their nation state collapsed into empire when Hitler comes to power in 1933. After they lose that war, their nation state falls apart. It's only united again in 1990, and it's only united again when it's united again inside a European integration project. In other words, even in the German case, there isn't really a nation state. And you can run this argument with whatever your favorite European country is. I mean, there are lots of great ones, but none of them really manage as nation states. England, it exists as an empire, right? And then as soon as it loses its empire, it falls back into Europe. It's the same with all the big European countries where we like to go on vacation if we can get a visa. Portugal, the Netherlands, it doesn't matter. They were all empires, and when they lost their empires, they become nation states? No, not for a minute. Not for a minute. They fell back into European integration because nation states can't make it. So this is a general principle. Nation states can't make it. They need something bigger than themselves. And even more than this, obviously, ethnic nation states can't make it. Okay, it's an ethnicity, might be an attractive idea, but it's not a very successful political idea. So this leads me to what I want to say about the nation, where Ukraine and Europe are in a kind of dilemmatic relationship now, in the last couple of years especially. I found this kind of fascinating. What is the Ukrainian nation? Rhetorical question, please don't answer. What is the Ukrainian nation? I mean, as I see it, it's largely a political sort of nation, right? Like it's dependent not upon a common understanding of history, which as far as I can tell, one doesn't really have. We don't have one either, by the way. We don't even have a language, right? I mean, you guys have one, arguably two. We speak English. We only have one language, right? Americans don't have any language. We just have this language we took from England, which makes it really funny. There's actually a point to this. When Americans say, well, Ukrainians speak Russian, therefore they don't exist. Okay, so then when we speak English, does that mean we don't exist? Like there's a certain really weird lack of self-awareness in the West, in Europe, and America too. So, the Swiss also don't have a language. The Swiss don't have a language, the Austrians don't have a language. Canadians have two languages, which aren't neither of them is Canadian, right? We Americans kind of have one language, we sort of speak English, and that's pretty much it for most of us. So we all have zero languages, and yet we look at Ukraine and we say, well, you don't exist because some of you speak Russian. And this is actually getting to the point I'm trying to make. It seems to me that the contemporary lesson of Ukraine, the contemporary lesson as of the last couple of years, and I'm happy to hear you disagree with me, would be that nation building generally has to be political. Because the means that the other kinds of nation building which took place in the 20th century, which involved mass slaughter and ethnic cleansing, are generally now regarded as being out of bounds. And are generally not, and often aren't even really, not only did they not work very well, but now they're generally regarded as morally off the picture. They're not going to happen. But I think it's unquestionable that the Ukrainian nation, despite all the other problems that you have, which are considerable, the Ukrainian nation is consolidating along something like political lines. What's interesting about Europe is the difficulty that Europeans have with seeing that. Because the official European view, if you can talk about such a thing, the official idea is that, yes, of course, nations are political. But as soon as there's any kind of stress, Europeans, Americans too, fall back into the idea of ethnicity. As soon as there's a moment of pressure, they say, okay, wait, what language should they speak? Where do they come from, right? Which led to this kind of crazy idea that only, this crazy dilemma precisely for Ukrainians during the Maidan, during the war up to today, where if you speak Ukrainian, that means you're a crazy Ukrainian nationalist. And if you speak Russian, that means that you should be ruled by Putin, right? What Europeans, this is not my view, right? You understand that's not my view. Neither of those is my view. But the way that the West tends to function is that in moments of pressure, we fall back, despite everything we say, into this ethnic kind of reasoning. And Ukraine is a challenge to that, because you can't say that Ukrainians are, Russians or whatever because they speak Russian. But we have a lot of trouble with that in the West. It's when I tell people in the West that Kyiv is a bilingual city, right? That there's only one bilingual capital in Europe, really, and that's Kyiv. No one believes that. I mean, I'm not sure what they think is true, but no one believes that Kyiv is a bilingual city. It's a point that I make over and over again, and no one really seems to get it. And the reason, I think, has to do with our own limitations, right? Whether you're in Russia or Paris or New York, you tend to think that people just speak one language. So the second dilemma, or the second form of engagement between Europe and Ukraine is precisely this idea of the nation. Because ironically, Ukraine embodies the kind of, not all of you, I mean, I realize some of you have quite extreme views. I'm looking at you. No, it's a joke. It's a joke. I wasn't looking at her really. It's a joke. Don't look at her. So I lost my train of thought. So the point is that you actually embody, and so like you have lots of problems. Okay, I know you have lots of problems. I just spent a day listening to all of your problems, but you embody politically actually a kind of ideal, which is multilinguality. Right? That's a European ideal, which doesn't actually exist in very much of the European Union. Even in Switzerland, where it's supposed to exist, it doesn't actually exist, right? It really doesn't. There is actually no bilingual city in Switzerland, and Brussels isn't really a bilingual city either. It doesn't really exist in Europe. They talk about multiculturality, but they don't actually have it. Whereas you have it, you don't talk about it, but you have it, right? And so the irony is that you represent something that Europeans generally think is good, and they don't notice it when they see it. They don't notice it when they see it. Like this idea that nations must be political, that Ukraine proves that that's true, but Europeans don't want to see it. So that's the second dilemma. What is the nation? The third dilemma is about civil society, or what to do with civil society, where civil society actually matters. Now, when I said before that the nation state is never sufficient, which I mean I'm happy to talk to you about later, but let's assume the nation state is not sufficient. What then do you do? Well, what comes to the aid of the nation state? This thing called civil society. It can help the nation state in various ways. And in one of them you can see both in Ukraine and in the European Union. So consider the refugee crisis in the European Union now. The people who have been out front in helping Syrian and African refugees have been precisely representatives of non-governmental organizations, old ones or new ones that were made up to address the crisis. And in places like Hungary and Austria, civil society has been much more progressive than the state. In fact, in the Austrian case, it's probably moved the state around a little bit. So that's what civil society does. It does things the state doesn't want to do, and it sometimes does things for the state. Right? Like, for example, Ukraine's war with Russia is in large measure on the Ukrainian side, civil society doing things which the state can't do or doesn't want to do, right down to and including prisoner exchanges, things that normally the normal states would do in this country, civil society tends to do. Why is this so important? It's so important because what civil society can offer, and Europeans have forgotten this, but it's very important here in Eastern Europe generally. What civil society can do is it can reach above the state. It can reach out for norms and institutions that are beyond the state. So the classic old example of this, and I am not actually old enough to remember this, although I bet you think I am. The classic old example of this were the 1970s and the human rights movements in the 1970s, where in Ukraine, in Czechoslovakia, in Russia, pretty much everywhere there was some kind of Helsinki organization, the idea of which was to hold governments to the notions of human rights that were actually already written into their constitutions. So what civil society does is it takes something which is outside the country, an idea, a norm, a law, something, and then tries to apply it to the nation state itself. And this is how I see the Maidan. Again, I'm happy to have you correct me or change my mind. But what was happening, I think, in the Maidan was that civil society is reaching out to Europe and trying to bring in these norms from the outside, right? The European Association Agreement is not interesting in its detail, but it's interesting because it's a way of trying to change Ukrainian society. And that's what civil society can do. It can reach out beyond the state and try to improve the state by pulling in things from the outside. Now, the dilemma here for Europe and for Ukraine is this. It's not clear that Europeans really remember how important this is. In fact, it's interesting to see how many East Europeans, that is people west of you, but East Europeans, don't remember how important this is. Whereas arguably, even in the European Union, you can't do without a civil society that's European-minded, because the state is not, in its nature, European-minded. The state, by its nature, is national, because that's where the electorate is. But the civil society can be European-minded. So in that sense, again, the Maidan was something which you only see very weakly in the European Union itself. That is a European-minded civil society. The dilemma is whether Europeans can realize that or not. Okay, which leads me to the next dilemma, which is the dilemma of, this is going to be really old-fashioned, and I hope you have like your postmodern tomatoes ready. The dilemma of truth. Okay, so I'm going to set aside the question, what is truth, which like we can return to in question and answer if you want. But let's imagine for a minute that truth is something that civil society uses against governments, right? It's very hard for civil society to operate without some notion of truth. It's very easy for government to operate without some notion of truth. If you have power, you don't need truth. And I realize I'm describing like a lot of your personal relationships right now, so try to pay attention. If you have power, you don't need truth. If you don't have power, then you need truth, right? Truth is a weapon of the weak. Okay, and I like truth, by the way. I don't mean to insult truth when I say it's a weapon of the weak, but truth is a weapon of the weak, just like law is a weapon of the weak, or principle is a weapon of the weak. Anything which aspires to be universal, to function outside the constraints of an immediate situation, is a weapon of the weak. So truth is a weapon of the weak. And so civil society needs truth, because if you can't make a truth claim as civil society, you can't make authorities feel guilty. If you can't make a truth claim, you can't attract the attention of the rest of the world, right? So, so consider, for example, all of the people, the Ukrainian citizens, who are now in one way or another being repressed by the Russian government, right? I mean, you know the cases better than I, Savchenko and so on. What if you said, maybe it's the case that they're guilty, maybe they were innocent, we don't really know because there isn't any truth. No, you can't make that kind of claim. If you're going to be a civil society appealing to the West about some individual prisoner of conscience, you have to say, this filmmaker is innocent. You have to say he exists, he's a filmmaker, he's innocent. If you can't make truth claims, then you can't appeal to the wider world, right? Because you can only appeal to the wider world with universals. Why is this so interesting? Well, it's interesting because the confrontation between Russia and Ukraine since late 2013, over the Maidan, then about the war and the occupation ever since, has largely been about, it's been about many things, of course. It's been about human suffering, human life and death. It's been about the existence of your state. It's been about the future of Europe. But it's also been about truth. And this is where the dilemma for Europe comes in. At a number of different levels, the engagement between Russia and Europe has been very blurry. It's been very blurry. The Europeans have had a hard time seeing things the way they are. Now notice I just made a truth claim, right? See, like I'm now in the position of the weak saying like, hey Europe, you have to notice something, which I've been doing for the last 2 years. And you can't do that unless you make a truth claim. You can't say, hey Europe, pay attention because maybe this, maybe that, I don't know. You just can't do that. If you're going to make these kinds of appeals, you have to make truth claims. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that this encounter between Russia and Ukraine has been very blurry from a European point of view. From the beginning, like when Russia invaded Crimea, you all remember this, but we simply could not figure out what was going on, right? The Europeans were very hesitant to accept like the basic evidence of their senses that an old-fashioned invasion was going on. The Maidan, I was shocked by this because I was following the Maidan in Ukrainian and in Russian, and then I was invited to do American talk shows, and I was just stunned at what the questions were, right? Because I mean I feel like I was in some sense fairly close to the reality, but then like I went on American talk shows, and the first questions were, so are they all fascists or are they just mostly fascists? And at that point, I realized like I had no idea that like I was watching Russian television, so I was aware that this was a trope on Russian television, but I had no idea that actually it was in the wider world until I went on an American talk show. And this was like the first question, like, are they all fascists or are they just mostly fascists? And then I realized, okay, there are some truth problems going on here, right? There's something that's going on, and then I started thinking about Russian propaganda and how it worked in the West and so on. And in the way that it works, I won't bore you with this because you're probably much better readers of Russian propaganda than I am, but the way that it works is at a couple levels. First of all, it works like commercial marketing. So they pick out segments of a political market and they direct their various messages at those segments. So for example, if you're a German, they tell you that you should feel very guilty about the Second World War and therefore you should let Russia do whatever it wants, which doesn't seem like it makes much sense, but like it works really well. I'm looking for my German friends. It works really well in Germany. If you are a South Slav, they'll say like this is orthodoxy and so on. If you are on the French right, they'll say we're fighting against decadence. If you're on the French left, they'll say we're fighting against the Americans. If you're a Jew, they'll say we're fighting against Nazis. And if you're a Nazi, they'll say we're fighting against Jews. All of those propaganda messages exist. They're all targeted for various segments of the big political market out there, and they're totally unworried about contradiction. They just don't care, right? Which leads me to the second point. It's not just that they fragment the world, it's also that the propaganda, I think quite explicitly, is designed to undermine people's confidence that there is anything like truth at all. So I think in addition to being unintentionally confusing, I think it's also intentionally confusing. I think it's meant to make you doubt. So what one notices with, for example, American students who watch a lot of RT, whatever you call it, who watch a lot of their sender to us, it's not that they're sure about anything, it's more that they have this worldview which is like, well, who knows? Like, maybe it was this, maybe it was that, maybe it was Eskimos, maybe it was Elvis, like maybe it was the CIA. It generates like this radical uncertainty. And of course, radical uncertainty and self-doubt then eventually leads to conspiracy theories. Like, you can't trust anything, right? You can't trust anything, therefore there must be some hidden hand, behind everything. So that's the way the propaganda works. In both cases, whether it's political marketing or whether it's this kind of more metaphysical and malevolent assault on truth as such, the truth is what the stakes are. And what I'm trying to claim is that this is a dilemma for Europe. Because let's say you're an average European, like an average post-Enlightenment, postmodern European, your basic view about truth is something like, well, there isn't really one truth, what's truth anyway, very old-fashioned concept. But then what if you're confronted by an example where the existence of truth really matters? Like, for example, is there an invasion or not? Is the European Union threatened or not? Are they all fascists or not? These are things that are, fairly straightforward truth claims. And I think this has been a direct, as it were, philosophical challenge, both in Europe and the United States. To take a step back, it's actually seriously a philosophical challenge because I think that what Russia does is that it operationalizes a lot of French theory from the 1970s and 1980s. I think it actually takes French postmodernism and puts about $250 million a year behind it every year, and then sees what it does to the rest of society. So it's like a dream come true. It's like Baudrillard, like having this unbelievable revenge on the rest of us. That joke gets a lot of laughs in Berkeley. It's like French theory actually being turned into some kind of political hammer. Which leads me to the final dilemma that I wanted to talk to you about, and that is the dilemma of war itself. If you don't believe in truth, it's very hard to believe in war, right? If you don't believe that there is something to fight for, then it's very hard to believe that war is necessary. And this is where the conflict in Ukraine has hit Europe really, I think, at a weak point. So to reel back a moment, back to Crimea, in a way the Ukrainian reaction to Crimea was a very European reaction, right? We don't really know what's happening, we're not sure what's happening, oops, we just lost a war, right? That was, and that was, in a strange way, like if you had time to ask the Europeans what to do, they would have told you to do nothing. And that was bad advice. Because the loss of Crimea was, I don't mean this now in a humanitarian, I'm not talking about the Tatars or the Ukrainian minority or the suffering of the Russian majority or anything. The loss of Crimea was a geopolitical disaster for everybody. I don't mean just like the sadness of Ukrainians that you lost it. It was horrible for everybody because it destroyed the European order, because now territory has been changed, territorial boundaries have been changed by violence, but it was also terrible for Russia. Right? Because if Russia hadn't had any resistance in Crimea, I think it's unlikely that they would have blundered into the Donbass the way that they did. And if they hadn't blundered into the Donbass the way they did, then things would now be better for everybody, including the Russians. who are actually in a very bad way right now. So if you don't, so what's the problem with war? The problem with war is that the whole model of European integration thinks that people who are in favor of European integration think that it's all about peace, which in some measure is true, but it was founded after a victorious war, and it's always been grounded in some kind of military deterrence, admittedly funded by, you know, those nasty people from the other side of the Atlantic. It's always been based on some kind of military deterrence. And so the kind of fairy tale belief that war is never necessary confronts the events in Ukraine very dramatically, because, rounding back and trying to collect up my themes, the war in Ukraine is not really about Ukraine. It's actually about Europe. And I don't mean that in just some grand way. I mean it very specifically, that Russian foreign policy in 2013 didn't turn against Ukraine. It actually turned against Europe. And they processed the Maidan not so much as a Ukrainian event, but as a European event. And their decision to intervene in Ukraine militarily was part of a much larger policy designed to destabilize the European Union. And so, in fact, it may not even be the biggest part. Supporting European populists may turn out to be the more significant element of Russian policy. So you were part of this much larger effort to undermine the European Union. Which brings me to the final thing that I wanted to say about Europe, and then I'll be done, and then we can talk. And that is that the final dilemma has to do with attraction. So the whole conflict begins because Europe is attractive for the European Union is attractive for many Ukrainians, and the European Union is attractive to many Ukrainians for reasons which I've mentioned. You know, Ukrainian history is a European history. The Ukrainian nation state, like all nation states, needs somewhere bigger to go. I mean, face it, if France needs somewhere bigger to go, and they do, then you need somewhere bigger to go as well. Italy needs somewhere, if Germany needs somewhere bigger to go, then you need somewhere bigger to go. The nation can't make it. It's attractive for reasons of civil society. Civil society sees Europe as a way to make the state perform better, and that's absolutely true. It's attractive for reasons of truth, if you want. The European Union is a zone where it's possible to function as a historian or as a journalist, which is a little bit iffy in this country, and it gets pretty impossible further east. And of course, it's attractive as a way out of war. So in all of these dilemmas, the European Union can seem like a solution. And for all of these reasons, the European Union can seem like an answer to Ukraine's problems. What I want to say is that that's a dilemma for the European Union, because it's not like the European Union wants to be attractive, right? It doesn't want to be attractive. It's like a beautiful woman who wakes up in the morning, you know, and looks fantastic when she's naked but doesn't care, you know. They don't want to be attractive. They just are. It's just the way they are. They can't do anything about it, and they can't stop being attractive. Like they don't necessarily want Russians and Belarusians and Ukrainians to join, but they can't help but be attractive because of all these basic reasons. And this is their dilemma. They're attractive because of the way they work. The European Union is attractive because it works. The moment it stops being attractive is the moment when it no longer works, right? So the moment that Ukrainians and others are no longer drawn to the European Union, that will be because the European Union is broken, right? That will be because the European Union itself has ceased to operate. So that's what I mean when I say that you're all in this together. Not just in the negative sense, that the Russian war on Ukraine is also an attempt to destabilize the European Union, but also in the positive sense. So long as the European Union exists and functions, it's going to be attractive to Ukrainians. And if it stopped being attractive to Ukrainians, that would be bad news for Europeans, because that would mean that their union had come effectively to an end. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I will moderate this Q&A session, and just raise your hand and introduce yourself before asking the question, please.
Hi, my name is Yaroslava Barbieri. I was struck by the kind of discussion that you led on the dilemma on truth. And I have kind of a provocative counter-argument maybe, because when we speak about the creation of truth regimes, it's always something that happens in a dialogue. So you said that truth is the weapon of the weak, whereas if you're powerful, you don't need necessarily truth. But the problem I have is that, you know, if it's a dialogue and there's the powerful with the weak, the problem is that the powerful has much more means to create a regime of truth. And this is like, for instance, what happened with all the narrative in the Euromaidan, that, you know, Ukrainians were doing Euromaidan and they had the narrative coming from the local reality and they had their own regime of truth. And whereas Europe was creating its own one, and it ended up creating this kind of distortive narrative. So like, my question is, what do you think are the reasons behind the fact that, you know, still the powerful has much more means to create truth, whereas the weak has less means, and how do we cope with this?
Okay. So let me start by telling you a story, and then I'll try to answer your question. When Yale University started its Russian Studies program, our first guest was the Russian ambassador to the United States. And in answer to a question about events in Ukraine, he said, well, you have your narrative, and we have our narrative. And I thought, you know, oh God, it's the 1980s again, and I'm back in university, right? Narrative in your question is another word for, you know, for truth regime, let's say. Like, they have one way of telling the story, we have another way of telling the story. And the basic point is that all that there is truth regimes. Like, truth regimes, there might be many of them, but that's all that populates our brain. When I say a truth claim, what I mean is the claim that there is in fact truth, not just regimes of truth, not just manufacture of what, you know, Americans call truthiness, things that sound true, but there is actual truth, right? And what I'm saying is that when you're weak, you have to claim that there's actual truth for the reason that you give, because the strong people always have a better, more effective capacity to generate, let's call it plausibility, okay? So in January of 2014, Russia was much better at generating plausible images of like chain-rattling Ukrainian fascists than Ukrainians were at generating images of multi-generational, multicultural people wanting liberalism, right? But that doesn't mean that this image was true, that the chain-rattling fascist, and this one was false. It just means that this one was more effective. And when you're weak, you have to be able to say, hey, forget about all the stuff which is clouding the discussion. Because precisely the strong are better at generating all those clouds. There is a clear bright light of sunlight. There's a clear like ray of sunlight somewhere. Now I'm going to put aside the question of whether there really is truth. There is, but I'm going to put it aside and just say that when you're weak, what you're saying is precisely beyond truth regimes. There's actually truth, right? So if you're Ukrainian in the position Ukrainians are in, you can't just say, well, Russia has really good propaganda and Ukraine has really bad propaganda, which would be true. Like those are both true claims. Russia has good propaganda. You can't just stop there. You then have to say, but let me tell you what's actually happening, right? And any Ukrainian who stops with like, Russia has good propaganda and we have bad propaganda, I think would be kind of insane. But you have to actually then say, well, you know, despite the fact that our propaganda is really bad, let me try to tell you what's actually happening in Odessa or whatever. And if it weren't for that, if it weren't for like that ability to actually aim for truth, then things would be much, much worse than they are now, is what I'm trying to say. Because it's only in the West, at least as far as I understand it, insofar as we understand things at all in Ukraine, it's been precisely because of really old-fashioned people like reporters going to Odessa or Dnipropetrovsk or Lvivska or whatever and actually trying to figure out what's going on. If we had just relied on the truth factor or the plausibility factories, we would be completely, you know, disorganized out of our wits. And the fact that we're not completely disorganized out of our wits is because I think people like actually allow themselves to be drawn in by Ukrainians making truth claims and saying like, hey, like if you come to Kyiv and actually report, you can stay in my apartment for free or whatever it might be. So, okay, that's my answer.
Thank you.
I have also a question related to your dilemma of truth and history. Namely, may place with history or manipulation of history be justified in certain circumstances? And if yes, then to what extent? So let me explain very briefly what I mean. Namely, you mentioned which I concur entirely, that you can't understand European Ukrainian history without broader European context. But you also can't understand European history without the context of Polish and Russian nation-building projects, which involve Ukrainians as Ruthenians or as little Russians, which is absolutely neglected in Ukraine and in, let's say, the opinion of many professional researchers. If you just look at the today's, I don't know, narratives or this dominant vision of European history, it's full of different, let's say, smaller or bigger manipulation. But on the other hand, researchers and public intellectuals perfectly understand that it is a good tool to mobilize the nation and to accelerate nation-building processes, especially now in the turmoil when Ukraine is a victim of Russian aggression. So actually the question is, how should professional historians, but also intellectuals which support Ukraine, how they should react on different views promoted now by Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance, which are hardly understandable from the point of view only of the truth, but which are understandable from the point of view of let's say, nation-building processes and war propaganda. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think that's really complicated. So, faced with propaganda, I think it's legitimate for historians to be critical defensively, right? So, if for example, the Russian Federation launches the idea that there was this thing called Novorossiya and that it existed for centuries and that it included Kharkiv, I think it's perfectly legitimate for historians then say, well, it didn't actually last for centuries, it didn't actually include Kharkiv, and so on and so on. And I think it's also legitimate for historians to say that the reason it was called Novorossiya was because it wasn't Russia, right? That's something historians know, right? New England is called New England not because it is England, because it's not. New Caledonia is called New Caledonia not because it's Scotland, but because it's not. And so on. New Jersey is not Jersey. Things are called new because they're not something else. So it's legitimate for historians to make those kinds of points, plain defense. And I also think it's legitimate for historians to make fun of propaganda, like to draw attention to it and to encircle it with arguments, so long as it's all defensive. You know, if the president of Russia wants to claim that because Volodymyr was baptized in Crimea, therefore, like Crimea belongs to Russia, I think historians have a perfect right to make fun of every element of that, and maybe even an obligation. I don't think historians, though, have an obligation to play offense. I don't think, and here, this is a distinction that I make, and it may not always be clear in practice, but I think it's clear enough in principle. I think when historians are reacting to things that are out there in the world, it's okay. But for historians to consciously build up a false picture of national history, I think is professionally wrong, but also I think counterproductive, because the way that you actually get a nice national history is that you have people arguing against each other, right? So, like Ukraine, Lipinski and Hrushevsky are arguing against each other. I mean, as you know this stuff much better than I do. But when you actually have a civil society with smart historians arguing against each other, then you actually have a national history. You don't get a national history because like someone designs it from A to Z. That's totalitarian, basically. Like if one person designs a history which shows where everything in the whole, every Ukrainian fits in some way, that's actually kind of terrifying. So I don't think that historians should be trying to draw up a scheme of national history. And I have a very old-fashioned view that precisely in times of war, intellectuals have to keep cool, and historians have to keep cool and not let themselves be drawn in. I don't actually think Ukrainians need history to fight this war. In fact, I've been struck by how the experiences of the last 2 years are much like the actual experiences that Ukrainians have seem to be more important than historical memory, right? The Maidan itself is an experience. The annexation of Crimea is an experience. And indeed, for me, this has been an interesting difference between Ukrainians and Russians, that for Russians, the war they're fighting in Ukraine is much more a television war. Like they're watching it on television, the way that we watched the Iraq War. They're watching it on television, and they're understanding it in historical terms, as like some kind of extension of the Second World War, whereas Ukrainians are experiencing it much more in much more human terms, and I think much less historical terms. And that is actually a kind of maybe important difference now between Russian and Ukrainian political culture, is that Russian political culture is fighting these really, it's treating war as this really abstract thing, whereas for Ukraine it's much more concrete. Personally, I think the Ukrainian version is a little healthier. But the moment, so if historians make it more abstract or like place it into some kind of continuum or whatever, I don't think they're actually serving their country.
It's so easy.
Thank you for an inspiring talk. And I would like to come back to your last two dilemmas. So it seems for me that actually when we are talking about dilemma of truth and war, it's mainly dilemma of values. And in this sense, if we can look at EU, we can see kind of crisis on conceptual level or crisis on the level of values, first of all. And in this sense, quite logical answer we can observe it's returning to idea of nation states. But you mentioned actually that opposite we can observe collapse of nation state as well. So in this case, where would you find a point of reference for Europe as a value-based or as a something united entity, etc., etc.?
Okay, great. I'm glad you asked that question because I have an answer. I'm not sure it's the. I don't know if it's an answer that any European will ever accept, but I think there is actually a good historical answer to that. The Europeans tell themselves the story that the European Union was a response to war. And this is a really nice story, because wouldn't it be nice if we fought wars and we suffered in wars and then learned from that peace was a good thing? That would be great. I mean, it would show how rational we are and so on. But historically, that didn't actually happen, at all. That didn't happen. The people who suffered the most in the Second World War, were people like Poles and Jews and Ukrainians and Belarusians. It's not, first of all, they weren't in the European Union, and secondly, it's not clear to me that they learned the lesson that peace is such a good thing. I mean, judging from Polish and Israeli and political culture, it's not clear that they learned the lesson from the Second World War that war is so bad, right? So there is no direct correlation between suffering and learning from suffering. I don't think that's historically true. In the case of the West European powers, they didn't learn from the Second World War not to fight wars. If they had, they wouldn't have then continued to fight wars throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s in Africa and Asia, right? But they did, and you know how long they kept fighting those wars? Until they lost. They kept fighting colonial wars until they got their hats handed to them, at which point they gave up. And that's true of everyone. The French, the British, the Portuguese, the Dutch, they basically continued fighting wars until they lost, right? At which point they then choose the European Union as the alternative, okay, the European communities. The European integration project is where you go after colonialism fails, right? And so, if you tell the story this way, then the German version is, and remember, the Germans are the people who were behind European integration from the beginning up to now. The German version is not, we learned from the Second World War that war is bad. No. The true version is, they were the last colonial power. Their attempt to conquer Eastern Europe was a colonial enterprise. It failed spectacularly and very, very quickly, leaving tens of millions of people dead, including millions of Germans. So they learned the colonial lesson rather quickly because their colonial episode was such an unbelievable disaster. And so then their little gesture towards France and Belgium and the Netherlands and Luxembourg can be understood as it's post-colonial. Okay, so we're not going to do that anymore. They also lost half their country. So we're not going to do that anymore, we're going to do something else. And the same is true with the French, right? The French start to get really enthusiastic about European integration when they lose everything else. When they lose in Indochina, when they lose in North Africa. So the European, Western Europe, it's not that they fight wars, stop fighting wars, or they learn from war. They lose wars. And when they lose their colonial possessions, the European market is where they go afterwards. That's a story of European integration which I think actually makes sense, as opposed to the myth which they all seem to believe, especially the ones in the EU, which they learn from. This is also, it's important for anti-Americanism, because the idea is that Europeans learned something from the Second World War and Americans didn't, which is just nonsense. They just lost a lot more wars faster than we did, right? I mean, we're catching up on losing wars. We'll catch up eventually. But the Europeans just lost a lot more wars faster than we did, and that's the main difference. It's not that they learned from the Second World War and we didn't. That's actually absurd. So if you see the European Union as a post-colonial project, then you can actually extract a value if you want, because you can say it's not a peace project. It's an anti-colonial or post-colonial project. And it's post-colonial because that's where the English and the French and the Germans can go, right? All these dreadful European colonial powers. But it's also post-colonial because colonized parts of Europe can go there too. So places like Poland or the Czech Republic or Serbia or what have you, that historically were part of empires. As of 2004 and 2007, they could join the European Union, which is really interesting because it means the European Union now embraces colonies, places that used to have colonies, and places that used to be at the bottom of the empire, right? So it's post-colonial in these two different ways. Now, if I were like in charge of like the morality of the European Union, which I can't be because like I'm just stopping myself from all of the jokes I was about to tell, but which I can't be, then that would be that would be the value story that I would tell. And the reason I would tell it is because I think it's closer to the actual historical record, and it makes Ukraine make a lot more sense. Because Ukraine is the post-colonial. I mean, I realize this is not so popular to say here, but Ukraine is a kind of post-colonial situation par excellence, where it was both the Soviet regime and the Nazi regime in different ways were colonial, really radical colonial regimes, extractive, horrible, brutal colonial regimes. And so it makes all kinds of sense that then Ukraine, when it becomes a nation state, which is what you do after colonization, would then want to join Europe. And then from the European point of view, it would make sense as to why Ukraine would want to do that. If you saw history in terms of the end of colonization and European Union as an alternative to colonization, then all of a sudden Ukraine wanting to join you makes a lot of sense. And the other part of the values thing is not just that you're anti-colonial, but that the European Union is actually different from empire in that the imperial relationship is always hierarchical. There's always center and periphery. Whereas the European Union actually props up the peripheries. It actually takes the peripheries much more seriously than their power or their economies would really warrant. So it's anti-imperial, if you like, in that sense as well. There's a kind of affirmative action for small states. So that's how I would run that. I mean, I think that's actually a really important question, but I've been trying to think of the answer.
My name is Timothée Gochakov, and my question is about the efficiency of the Russian propaganda. In the beginning of the conflict, we heard a lot of voices about talking about the legitimate Russian interest in Ukraine and stuff like that. It was very impressive how you described how the Russian propaganda segments the market. Sure it does. Now such voices, now the situation has changed over this year and a half and even earlier. And now such voices look like rather marginal. But do you think that this change is irreversible? Or not? Or this discourse, this narrative can come back to the, so to say, to the level of the general discussion and can dominate again?
Right.
Thank you.
So, the problem with the propaganda is that it works for long enough to get everyone in trouble. So, from the point of view of America or Western Europe, the two dominant tropes of propaganda, there were many themes, but the two dominant ones were the Ukrainians are all fascists and the Maidan was organized by the CIA. Those are the two dominant ones, that the Ukrainians are fascists and the Americans were behind it all. And although, each of which is kind of, they compete as to which one was more absurd. They're both really quite crazy. And I think few people now believe either of them. Well, I think fewer people anyway. But the problem with them is not that they have any kind of staying power, it's that they function for long enough to prevent a serious reaction, right? So European discourse, if you look back in January, February, March, April, May of 2014, European discourse was really confused and European action was really delayed by this fascism theme. I think it really hindered European policymakers, because, especially in Germany, because it had a certain amount of resonance, it slowed people down. And then likewise, the idea that it was all the Americans, that also slowed the Europeans down quite a bit. And I don't talk about what works in America, because America isn't really relevant in this whole crisis. And then I think eventually people realize that some of this isn't true. You know, you don't hear confessionals, like no one writes the article in the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung about like, I was a fool for Russian propaganda, and now I've like figured out how. But like many Germans have in fact actually. And if you look at like the recent results of the recent survey published by the Pew Foundation about the credibility of Russian, which includes questions about the credibility of Russian media and so on, it's actually striking how poorly it's working in Europe now, as compared to a couple of years ago. But the problem for me is that it works for long enough to get everyone in trouble. So including Russia, I mean above all Russia. Because if Russian propaganda didn't work so well, then they wouldn't get themselves into these kinds of disasters that they're in now. It's also obviously terrible for Ukraine and for Europe, but so it doesn't have to work permanently. It only has to work for a few months in order to like drive everyone into some very dark place. Personally, I don't think it's ever going to work as well again, because with Crimea, people were just not ready. The Americans writing reports on this stuff now say that the level of sophistication of the information war that was propagated with Crimea was unprecedented in history. That no one had ever been hit with anything of this many levels and this thing before. I don't think they're going to be able to do that again. Like if you look at the war in Syria, for example, they're doing some of the same stuff they did with Crimea. Like they send the people, they say they're not there, then they say, oh, we never said they weren't there. But it's just not as interesting as it was in Crimea, right? Like everyone looks at it and they say, yeah, you're there, okay? So we're just waiting for you to admit it. Whereas in Crimea, there was some legitimate like air of mystery what's actually going on. I don't think they're going to be able to do that again. I think that confrontation. I think Western societies put it a different way. Western societies are always going to be somewhat vulnerable to Russian propaganda because Western societies are Western societies. They're pluralistic. They're used to various kinds of debates, and so they'll always accept it as one point of view. But I don't think the particular vulnerability of the spring of 2014 can be repeated again. I think a lot of people, especially a lot of German elites, which is the most important group, I think a lot of German elites have figured out that they need to be more skeptical than they were. But who knows, like they may have great tricks that they're saving up for the next time. I don't know.
My name is Olena Gordienko. My question would concern your statement about the major Russian policy, which is to destabilize European Union, which is like much bigger plan. But what are your arguments, let's say, for the Westerners, for the Europeans? Because I just think that for a normal European, it's really hard to understand how that could actually impact them. You know, this like small conflict which the propaganda says is a civil war. You know, so what are the practical implications? How do you explain it to the Europeans that it's actually about much larger and geopolitical problem? Thanks.
Well, I spend a lot more time saying the same kinds of things that I would say to you. So I spend a lot of time explaining Ukrainian history, and then I spend a lot of time trying to explain the Russian propaganda, which is about not just about momentarily confusing people, but also about making Europeans less sure about things they need to be more sure about. And I talk more about the other aspects of Russian foreign policy, such as supporting European fascists, Nazis, populists, such as cultivating individual heads of state, such as trying to make sure that energy politics are done at a national rather than European level. And then there are plenty of Russian statements, such as their support of separatism, like they're in favor of all kinds of separatism. They're in favor of separatism generically, so they're in favor of Scottish separatism, for example. These are all policies. When you put them together, you can see that there's a coherent whole of trying to create some kind of alternative European structure. And if you pair this for President Putin's obvious nostalgia for the 1930s, it's not so hard to make a case to the Europeans that something's going on. But you're right. I mean, the immediate problem is that or at least was, that the Europeans want to say, well, that's some kind of conflict that's far away and doesn't concern us. And I sincerely believe that it's always been the opposite from the very beginning. And this is what I was saying way back in the early 2014, that it's not actually about Ukraine, that it's actually about the European Union. And that argument has gained a lot of traction inside the European Union since then. In fact, I think it's fair to say that pretty much everybody, whether they say so or not, understands now that something like that is true. Like everyone who matters in Europe more or less understands that something like that is underway. Some people deny it because they're in favor of it, right? I mean, so as I'm sure you all know, the Russian Federation funds French populism. It funds the Front National, right? And that's because the Front National is against European integration. It's for a return to the nation state. And so people from the Front National, they're not going to say like, hey, we like Russia because Russia's going to break up the European Union. But they're aware that that's what's happening because they're taking part in it. So I think the European elite has actually, more or less understood that this is what's happening. Now the question is whether they care enough about it to stop it from happening.